Significant research has been done regarding the theology and philosophy of different groups in ancient times. My goal here is to summarize the research on the topic of ex nihilo creation from the scholarly viewpoint. Video presentations later in the series deal purely with the biblical text. However, the historical context is an important part of understanding creation theology. The first group we will look at are the classic Greek philosophers, such as Parmenides, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Ironically, the term ex nihilo comes from the 5th century BC, the full phrase being ex nihilo nihil fit, which means out of nothing comes nothing. The Greeks believed that things cannot disappear into nothing, just as they can't be created from nothing. Essentially, they were describing what we understand as the law of conservation of mass and energy. Relating to the idea of the origin of the cosmos, the idea emerged concerning something which moves other things without itself being moved by anything, the unmoved mover. The unmoved mover, or the concept of a prime mover, is a philosophical concept explaining the origin of the universe. There is no effect without a cause. As implicit in the name, the unmoved mover moves other things, but itself is not moved by any prior action. This is kind of the beginning of Greek philosophical monotheism. The first cause was nothing we humans could relate to. It's immutable, unmoving, unchanging, and beyond our comprehension. Later on, this idea was expanded upon by St. Thomas Aquinas, and it became known as the first cause argument. The first cause argument begins with observation in physics, whereby nothing moves unless acted upon. There is essentially one scientific rule: every effect has a cause. Then it was reasoned that something must have caused the universe, the unmoved mover. The problem is that the conclusion of a first cause, an uncaused cause, breaks the one and only rule that was based on observation in reality. Assumptions needed to be added to the argument in order to try and reconcile the obvious contradiction. That conversation will be taken up again elsewhere. However, it should be understood that the Greek understanding of the prime mover was not understood in the context of ex nihilo creation. The school of thought influenced by the previously mentioned Greek philosophers is known as Platonism. This is something that changed over time, and you will see that the scholars use different terms to describe the evolution as Platonism, Middle Platonism, and Neoplatonism. To the ancient writers, existence meant organized existence, and non-existence meant chaos. Platonists called the pre-existent matter the non-existent. In their minds, there existed an eternal, chaotic, formless, and material substratum, which was no thing. There was relative non-being, not absolute nothing. And this way of thinking persisted until the age of Neoplatonism. It has been noted that in ancient Judaism and early Christianity, there was more focus on the God of the universe rather than focusing on the cosmos themselves. The Judeo-Christian emphasis on the creation was the idea that God created, not how God created. We don't find the kinds of texts in the ancient Hebrew world which attempt to address this issue directly. Speculation was likely discouraged. The phrases we find tend to be more non-specific and usually within the context of some other unrelated subject matter. However, it was generally understood that God hovered above the waters of the deep in order to create, and God continuously restrains this water from above the firmament and from the abyss. Here is an artistic rendition of God's creation as understood in the Hebrew culture. The idea is dividing the chaotic waters and creating space for the creation. There is the deep abyss below and the waters above the firmament. What later became the earth as we know it was first without form and void, and then God worked with that. Concerning the Genesis creation story, The biblical commentary on the Old Testament by Kale and Delitzsch states, "He is writing for the inhabitants of the earth and for religious ends, not to gratify curiosity, but to strengthen faith in God, the Creator of the universe. What is said in Genesis 1:2 of the chaotic condition of the earth is equally applicable to the heaven, for the heaven proceeds from the same chaos as the earth." The Greek and Hebrew traditions come together with Philo of Alexandria, who was a contemporary of Paul the Apostle. In his view of creation, Philo is known for interpreting the biblical story using Greek scientific categories and concepts. As the Greek philosophical monotheism concept began to become more prevalent, Philo began to equate the Hebrew Bible's creator God, Yahweh Jehovah, to the Greek unmoved mover. Philo is considered by scholars to have had significant influence on Christianity. Many early church fathers quote him, and some influence within Judaism and even Islam. In most of his writings, Philo describes creation from chaos, a pre-existent state destitute of arrangement, of quality, of animation, of distinctive character, and full of disorder and confusion. Sometimes Philo appears to contradict himself, or was at the very least ambiguous at times, saying, God created the whole universe out of things that had no previous existence. However, most scholars agree that he was not contradicting himself and was not all that ambiguous. Henry Chadwick explains an important distinction in Philo's use of words. In each case, the phrase he employs is ek meontos, not ex auk ontos. That is to say, it is not made from that which is absolutely non-existent, but from relative non-being or unformed matter, so shadowy and vague that it cannot be said to have status of being, which is imparted to it by the shaping hand of the Creator. Let's say that my family and I go to a beach, and we have in mind to create a sandcastle. Is there a sandcastle there? No. Does the sandcastle exist? No. There is no sandcastle here. There is no sign that there is a castle, and no sign that there will be a castle. There be no castle. There is no castle seen here. The castle is unseen. We created a sandcastle. We made it. You could even say that we brought the castle into existence, since the castle wouldn't have existed if we didn't go there and form it. Look at the sandcastle. Now the sandcastle is there. Now the sandcastle is seen. Now the sandcastle exists. There is a design here. This formation would not have happened in a million years if we hadn't gone there to create the sandcastle. The nature of how the water interacts to the sand on the shore does not promote this kind of structure, but instead, if left to its own nature, it would be wiped out by the tide and wind. Now, this example is not quite what the ancients had in mind, because we can see the sand from which the castle was created. Meanwhile, the ancient view of the cosmos involved creation from an unseen pre-existing substance, which was vague, chaotic, and formless. Nevertheless, the sandcastle is a good example because we can imagine the tide and wind wiping out the structure, much like the ancients imagined God holding back the waters of chaos that would wipe out his creation. Philo wrote, "When the substance of the universe was without shape and figure, God gave it these. When it had no definite character, God molded it into definiteness." Advocates of ex nihilo creation suggest that these teachings meant that God created chaos from absolutely nothing, and then created from that chaos. However, that kind of interpretation of these writings assumes something into the text that is not stated. In his research, Francis Young does an excellent job of explaining that these forced meanings into the text are without merit. Another contemporary reference comes from the Jewish pseudepigraphical book Joseph and Asenath. It says, "Lord God of ages, who brought the invisible things out into the light, who made the things that are and the ones that have an appearance from the non-appearing and non-being, Here, invisible things are considered non-appearing and non-being. Again, non-being is not understood as absolutely nothing, but instead something that you cannot see. From the Apocrypha, in 2 Maccabees 7:28, we read, I pray you, son, look to the heaven and earth, seeing everything in them, know that God made them from non-being, and the human race began the same way. Here's what the scholars say about the translation in the Greek. It should say, from non-being, as in, not out of things being, i.e., already existent individual things. The non-existent is not absolutely nothing, but the metaphysical substance in an uncrystallized state. However, you do not need to know Greek or be a scholar to see that this verse does not teach ex nihilo. Just look at the context. This is a mother who just saw her children die, and she goes back to their conception, and admits she doesn't know how it works. I do not know how your life began in my womb. It was God who did it. God who created the universe, the human race, and all that exists. He is merciful, and He will give you back life and breath again. God made it all, not out of things being, just as He made the human race. We know from Genesis 2:7 that man was created from the dust. Resurrection from the grave is also from the dust. Or consider the empty tomb with Jesus. So the context does not describe creation from nothing. So, what we find elsewhere in the Apocrypha is not a contradiction. Solomon 11:17 reads, For your omnipotent hand found no difficulty even in creating the world from formless matter. Sometimes, more obscure texts are used as evidence for creation ex nihilo. One example is 2 Enoch 24:2. Before anything at all existed, from the very beginning, whatever exists I created from the non-existent, and from the invisible, the visible. So, is the non-existent supposed to mean absolutely nothing? Advocates of ex nihilo say yes. However, they tend to neglect what it says in verse 4. Before any visible things had come into existence, I, the One, moved around in the invisible things. So keep in mind, the visible things were created from the invisible things. And it says before the visible things came into existence. So clearly, coming into existence does not mean from nothing. Later, in the same book, we find the text that says, The Lord is the one who laid the foundations upon the unknown things, and He is the one who spread out the heavens above the visible and the invisible things. In fact, if you go deep enough into the text, 2 Enoch teaches a kind of dualism which is subject to God's power. Translator F.I. Anderson explains, Out of the original invisible things, God calls two beings, Adoil, from whom is born the great light, and Arukas, from whom comes the darkness. The dualism of light and darkness arise from two primal beings, Adoil and Arukas. 2 Enoch does not say that God created them, but they are clearly under His control. The last supposed ex nihilo reference I will mention is from the Shepherd of Hermas. God who dwells in heaven and created that which is out of non-existence. Once again, ek me ontos alone cannot be taken as absolute denial of a material substrate. By itself, this definition is insufficient to carry the burden of a decisive and well-defined position because both ek and on are notoriously equivocal. To read creatio ex nihilo into Hermas goes far beyond the warrant of the text, which makes no clear claims to the presence or absence of material and provides no discussion of the position. The reasonable scholarly consensus looking at the Greek and Hebrew views of creation demonstrate that the texts describe creation from something rather than nothing. The evidence is shown either by context, like the woman in Maccabees describing the formation of a child in the womb, or from the sophisticated thinkers of the time, like Philo, who was more careful in his choice of words. The modern understanding of creation ex nihilo had not yet developed at this time.